dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. Today, we have two guests who I know you're going to really enjoy hearing from, Jim Sullos and Christopher Paul Carey. Jim is the president of the Edgar Rice Burroughs, Inc., and Christopher is the director of publishing. Now, for those of you who don't know, Edgar Rice Burroughs was an American speculative fiction writer best known for his prolific output in the adventure, science fiction, and fantasy genres. Probably you'll know him best for having created Tarzan of the Apes, John Carter of Mars, and Carson Napier of Venus. It's interesting that his bio begins, and I'm quoting from his bio, from the day he was born in Chicago on September 1st, 1875, until he submitted one half a novel to the All-Story magazine in 1911, Edgar Rice Burroughs failed in nearly every enterprise he tried, and yet he became one of the most successful adventure writers in history. Several years ago, I became fascinated with the relationship between Edgar Rice Burroughs and L. Ron Hubbard, and this has been an interview I've wanted to do for some time. Zine, ERB Zine for Edgar Rice Burroughs, published a 3-part series on Edgar Rice Burroughs and LRH, curated by Bill Hillman. I want to open by providing a perspective as to why I'm so excited to be doing this interview. In 1954, L. Ron Hubbard noted in a talk, Edgar Rice Burroughs, yes, of course, Edgar Rice Burroughs, weirdly enough, was he and H.G. Wells actually loom up now on this day and age as being terrific towers. My God, I mean, the man, the imaginative flow, which that man turned out compared to what you're picking up off the newsstands today is fabulous. But we even go into this level of operation that he was doing, and we can look on that as being a rather giant operation. We're having a rough time today in the arts, I should say. And that was what he said about Edgar Rice Burroughs. So obviously he really, really appreciated what he did. So with that said, let's get started. Welcome, Jim and Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Yep.
I'm definitely glad, like I said, to have you here. So if you can please just give me a brief introduction about the Edgar Rice Burroughs, Inc. and your work.
Well, Edgar Rice Burroughs incorporated himself in 1923. He's one of the first authors to ever do that.
Wow.
And he ran the company until his death in 1950, and then his grown children ran it for another 30 years before the company turned to outside management in the late 80s. The company really spends its time in 3 areas. One is publishing, a very active publishing program of which our director, Christopher Paul Carey, is in charge of and is giving it new invigoration. Also, movies and television. There's been over 50 Tarzan movies and over 230 television episodes, and we're working on more of them. And the last part is merchandising. There is merchandise, the Tarzan merchandise is worldwide, and that's our job to keep it out there and make sure the public knows what's available and incentivized to, and hopefully they will be incentivized to buy them.
Well, that sounds good. And then your work specifically, Christopher, on what you do as the director of publishing.
Yeah, so Edgar Rice Burroughs also started up his own imprint back in 1931. He put out, I think the first book that the company put out was Tarzan the Invincible, one of his Tarzan books. So he was self-publishing his own books. That was quite a, that really wasn't done back then. And that ran all the way till he passed away in 1950. And a few years back, Jim here decided to revive the publishing imprint and start putting out new books. We started with The Wild Adventures of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And then I came on board there as director of publishing and sort of reinvigorated the program. I had more experience in publishing, and that's why Jim brought me on. We launched 2 new lines, the Edgar Rice Burroughs universe, which is canonical stories. We're making sure they actually fit with the original stories, and we're bringing them forward into the future. And then the Edgar Rice Burroughs authorized library, which is a massive project where we're reprinting all of Edgar Rice Burroughs' 80-plus volumes of work, beginning with the Tarzan novels. We're about halfway through the Tarzan series right now, reprinting those. And these kind of deluxe, handsome hardcover editions with bonus materials from our archives that no one has ever seen before. So that's what I do.
Do you use the original Frazetta artwork?
No, what we're doing is using artist by the name of Joe Jusko. He's an award-winning artist, and he is going to be painting every single one of these covers. And he's based in upstate.
Wow. So all new art.
So it's all new art, and they're beautiful pieces of art. And the cover itself will sell these books, we're pretty sure. I wish
it worked before, so there's no reason why it won't work again.
It's beautiful art, all hand drawn by him. In addition to the colorful covers that he has printed, we also have a frontispiece, a black and white frontispiece by him at the beginning of the book, and that complements the storyline.
Oh, that's great. So I cut you off there, Christopher. Is there anything else what you're doing, like I said, on your publishing program that you've been brought on board to create?
Yeah, so I mean, the big thing that I'm working on are both of those two lines, the Edgar Rice Burroughs universe and the authorized library. Both of them are massive projects. When you're working with deep continuity from like the 80 some books that he wrote, you have to do a lot of working with the authors. So I basically I kind of treat my authors like a creative team, kind of like you would with a group of writers working for a television show or something like that. So we have regular consults, we have video conferences, because we're all trying to line it all up and create just Edgar Rice Burroughs created a universe. He was really the first one to have this coherent interworking universe where he crossed characters over. Like Tarzan went to Pellucidar. He had four of his major series crossed over with one another, and then a lot of his standalone works had minor crossovers in them. So it's this very elaborate world building and continuity. And so I'm the one. I'm also creative director of the Edgar Rice Burroughs universe. So I kind of manage all of that. And we're also publishing comic books. We have various licensees for comic books, but we're specifically with the Edgar Rice Burroughs universe, the canon comics. We're working with American Mythology Productions to put out canonical stories through comic books too. So they're kind of just as valid as the novels that we're putting out. So I do a lot of work with them as well. So,
wow, that's very, very impressive. So Jim, how did you originally get connected with the Edgar Rice Burroughs Corporation or company or Inc. to then move up? And did you just walk in and become the president, or did you? Was it some type of a takeover, a hostile takeover that you became now the president, or did you work up from janitor to the top, or how'd that work?
I came from the outside. I was the outside accountant for many years for the corporation. So I knew all about the tax and accounting issues and financial issues, but I really knew nothing about the internal operation. And then in 2008, we had a retirement of a longtime president and an unexpected death of the grandson of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And all of a sudden they needed a president, and I was available. So since 2008, I have been the president, and dealing with the internal operations is an entirely different job than being an outside accountant. So I had a learning curve.
No doubt. But it's amazing, though, just my reality, at least, of what's happened here, because I didn't really have that much of a connection with Edgar Rice Burroughs prior to your getting on there, and you've taken it and you've so exploded it into like a massive international corporation or a company, at least. But it's also your message is getting out there, because it's amazing. I've been involved with publishing since the mid '80s, and not until I connected up with yourself and with Zine did I really have any perception of Edgar Rice Burroughs as a major force in publishing. But then since you've taken the helm, it's amazing just how much his presence is being felt a century later. So that's, kudos to you on that.
Thank you. We're still working hard at it, and that's we're here to keep it going.
No doubt. So, Christopher, how'd you get involved? Like you said, you met up with, I don't remember you there, but you said you were at one of the Rise of Futures events that we held in Seattle. So obviously you're up in Seattle at the time. How'd you connect up with Edgar Rice Burroughs, Inc.?
Well, I was a longtime fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs, so I've been reading him since I was a kid, and one of actually my very favorite writer. And so a few years back, I actually went to one of the Edgar Rice Burroughs conventions, and I met Jim and Kathy Wilbanks, who's our vice president. And I pitched them I'm a writer also. So I pitched them the idea of writing a novel for them. So I wrote a novel. And so that's how we made initial contact. They already knew my name because I had written some works, co-written and expanding upon the works of Philip A. Farmer, the science fiction author Philip A. Farmer, who also wrote some stuff that intersected with Edgar Rice Burroughs, particularly the Ancient Opar series. And so I was already on their radar because the publisher of the Ancient Opar books had been in contact with ERB Inc. And so I wrote that novel. It was a joy to write. It was probably the easiest novel that I ever wrote because I just love Edgar Rice Burroughs. I'm very saturated in it in my subconscious, So it really just came out, and it got very good reviews. And then I just came to visit one time. I wanted to see where Edgar Rice Burroughs had his office, and so they invited me down, and I came here to visit. We went out to dinner, and then I kind of dumped on them all my thoughts about publishing. And so when an opening happened, when their other person who was running the publishing program left the company, and there was an opening, they thought of me. So, and they reached out to me. And so that's how I got on board here.
Christopher is a very accomplished author. We tapped him to do one of our wild adventures of Edgar Rice Burroughs books. And he wrote one called Swords Against the Moon Men, which was a combination of the Moon Men and what else?
Well, it had a John Carter crossover.
John Carter crossover. Thank you. That's right.
Yeah.
So that was an exciting novel. And that's been out 2, 3, 4 years now.
So that's really, really good, because that also having you come on board then with that kind of experience and that kind of love, because that's really important in publishing. It's successful publishing endeavors have the underlying love of publishing, love of books, to make it work. You have the people that come in strictly just, okay, it's just a job. It doesn't work, and it shows in the quality of what comes out from those publishers. So that no doubt has a lot to do with your success. So how much is the ERB line ERB, and how much of it is the other authors contributing to that universe?
So we have the Edgar Rice Burroughs Authorized Library, which is reprinting all 80 plus of Edgar Rice Burroughs' original works. So that's a major, major publishing initiative here. It takes up a lot of my time. And I would say it's about balanced between the two, but it takes a lot more work to produce a novel from scratch than it does to reprint a novel, even though we are spending a lot of time adding a lot of extra bonus material and a lot of production value to the authorized library. It still is a lot of time. So we've put out a lot more of the authorized library than we have of the Edgar Rice Burroughs universe yet, but we have a lot of plans in the works and a lot more books coming out. We have a new John Carter novel about to come out in a few months here. So called John Carter of Mars, Gods of the Forgotten, by a great author named Gary Gravel. And it's really the first John Carter novel written by an author other than Edgar Rice Burroughs. So there was a book called Tarzan, Conqueror of Mars by a great author named Will Murray, who's done a few novels for us.
I know Will quite well.
Oh, okay. And he wrote one called Tarzan, Conqueror
the Destroyer series.
Yes, exactly. Doc Savage.
Yeah.
And he wrote a novel called Tarzan, Conqueror of Mars that did have John Carter in it, but it wasn't primarily a John Carter novel. So Gary's is the first, just straight John Carter novel since Edgar Rice Burroughs was writing them. So really excited about that. So I'm working on that one right now.
Absolutely. Now I have a question, because we recently, or not that recently, but we went through a whole evolution of republishing all of L. Ron Hubbard's Pulp Fiction stories, which were 20, 30 years after Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote his stories. So we had to go through and how we, I know what we did to deal with nomenclature, because obviously English continues to evolve. And our endeavor was to keep it true to what he wrote and how he wrote, and using the language that he wrote with. But we created a glossary in the back of the books to define terminology which is no longer used in So it made it easy for people to understand what he's talking about, especially when you got some of the different Western terminology and lingo. And Mysteries has a lot of different jargon back then as compared to now. How have you been dealing with, the language of turn of the century 1900s with, 120 years later, on dealing with the language of Edgar Rice Burroughs?
Yeah, you want to?
That's a very good question, because that is a direct challenge to us as we reproduce these books 100 years after he wrote them. And we do indeed review them from a sensitivity standpoint to consider the new language of it. So it is a challenge, and Christopher's been very good at getting other people's opinions as we work through these reproductions, because we don't want to just unilaterally make the decisions ourselves. We have one point of view. We always try to be true to what Mr. Burroughs wrote, but as you say, it's got to be updated to appeal to the current audience, and we are attempting to do that. That's my take on it. Christopher has more to say about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, like Jim said, we're staying true to Edgar Rice Burroughs. So any changes that we make are very, very minor and do not affect the storyline or the characterization or anything like that. So
yeah,
I have a strong editing background. I was senior editor at do you know Paizo? Paizo, they published the Pathfinder playing game. So I was also involved in their fiction line, but pretty much all products that they put out for about 10 years. And so I also, it's just kind of a specialty of mine. I pay very much attention to inconsistencies in language and stuff like that. So when we're reprinting these books, all these books had different editors when they were working on them, and so there's a lot of incongruities between like whether this word's hyphenated in this book or not in that book. So there's also a lot of like minor textual changes that I make that just sort of bring it up to modern, Chicago Manual of Style, Merriam-Webster's. The reader is not going to notice, but it's actually going to make it more readable for the modern reading public. So it might be boring to people, but that's what I do. I just try to, make them.
No, it's important because you want to create the best possible representation of Mr. Burroughs. So that is important. Did he leave any direction in terms of republishing, or like the do's and don'ts, or like if it gets republished again, make sure you do this or change this or this, in terms of changes in novels that he wrote?
Not to my knowledge, but an interesting thing is that when his novels were originally published in the Pulse, and so they would often take a heavier hand with the editing and rewrite some of his stuff, in fact. And so when Edgar Rice Burroughs would have the books put out as books, whether it was his own company that was publishing them or A.C. McClurg was another big publisher of his, he would go back to his original manuscripts and restore the text. So we're trying to, go back to the original texts. We're taking as a baseline at this point the original first edition texts and then modifying them from there, because in the 60s and 70s there were some editions of especially the Tarzan books that were edited very similar to what we're doing now. They made minor tweaks just to bring them up to date and stuff. But rather than go back to those texts, at this point in our program, we're going back to the original first edition text so that we're not creating a hodgepodge kind of thing. We want to be as true to ERB as possible. So
I think another way to respond to that question, John, is that I don't think Edgar Rice Burroughs had any idea how influential he would be with the reading public after his death. I mean, there are people who read his books in the 50s and 60s and 70s, totally influenced. And if I could give you a quote from Ray Bradbury about how influential he was. What his quote was, this is written in the 80s. I've talked to more biochemists and more astronomers and technologists in various fields who, when they were 10 years old, fell in love with John Carter and Tarzan and decided to become something romantic. Burroughs put us on the moon. So there was an indication of the level of influence he had on including some of the people who are creating the Mars rovers now. One of the Mars rovers actually contained the book A Princess of Mars, and I've read it way back, and I've tried to find out which rover it was, because there've been 5 or 6 of them. But they actually put the book in the capsule. So that's how influential it was to the existing generation of NASA engineers and
Wow.
astronomers. Amazing.
I can find that out because I've done a few different interviews with multiple of the engineers that created the various rovers on Mars right now, and we've had a couple of them as speakers at our Rise to Future events. But Robert Hogg, who is currently the second in command of running the rover on Mars right now, the one that just landed. So he's running the project there on Mars right now. So I can ask him. That I didn't know that. It's never come up before, but that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that you say that about going back to the original source material from Edgar Rice Burroughs. We'd had a similar thing that occurred with L. Ron Hubbard with republishing all of his works. We took it back not to the pulps, but where we had manuscripts, we went to those, and that's what we did our proofreading on. We used that to put that, because sometimes they had to edit it down for word length for the magazine, purpose like that. Okay, I need 5,000 words. And if he submitted 5,200, then they chop it down to 5,000. So we don't have those concerns right now. So we just went back to the original source, his manuscripts, and proofread against that and did the editing against that to be able to republish what we did with the stories from the Golden Age.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, we have some interesting ones ahead of us. I've been looking forward to I'm looking ahead at some of the books that we have. And for instance, The Moon Maid, which was published, it's actually a three-volume, 3-book series, but it was published in book form as a single volume. And when that was published, Edgar Rice Burroughs really, the publisher made him chop it down. So he himself as the author did the edits on it and pared it really down, and it chopped a lot of text out of it. And so we have an interesting situation where we're going to have a challenge where we're going to have to decide what we're going to do, which text we're going to go with. Mm-hmm. In this case, it looks like that the pulp versions actually might have more of the true full Edgar Rice Burroughs expanded story in it. So we might go back to the original pulps for that. We do have some of the manuscripts from that, but I don't think all 3 books. So, and sometimes I do go back and I consult if I have a particular question, especially if there are some typos in the original first edition hardcovers, and sometimes I have to do a lot of research to figure out what the original intent of the author was, So it's an adventure, an adventure in editing. So,
yes. So did Mr. Burroughs, did he ever dictate his stories? Were they always either typed or handwritten?
In the early years, he would handwrite them. We have the original handwritten manuscript of Tarzan of the Apes, written in 1912, and also of A Princess of Mars, which originally was titled Under the Moons of Mars. And we have both of them in longhand. It's quite difficult to read, and we've toyed with the idea of publishing it with a written verbiage that could be readable right next to his handwriting manuscript. We've not gotten around to that, but it'll be a major undertaking someday. But he did in the 1920s develop something equivalent to a dictaphone, and we have a picture of him holding a microphone in his hand while he is dictating these storylines. So he converted whenever that technology arrived, which might have been around the years of the radio discovery in the mid-20s, maybe that's when he actually did that. And there was a fan who actually, a collector fan who actually has that manuscript, that recording device in his collection. And I don't know where he ever got it, but he must have surreptitiously got it away from our corporation somehow. So it's
somehow.
Yeah.
He used to ride. He lived in a ranch up in the hills. He used to ride his horse down where we are in our offices that go back to 1927, and he would just spend all day dictating, and then he'd ride his horse back up the hill.
Yeah, this is Tarzana, California, that Jim was talking about here. And if you've been to Tarzana lately, and then you imagine someone riding a horse down from the mountains, it's kind of unimaginable now to think of because it's so built up here now. But
Yeah, but for people who don't know, Tarzana was named because that whole Tarzana was Edgar Rice Burroughs' estate.
yes,
His ranch was how big?
It was about 550 acres. He bought it from the estate of General Harrison Gray Otis, who was a founder of the Los Angeles Times. And he passed away by 1916, and the estate was settled in around 1918. And then, if you recall, 1918 was the first movie of Tarzan of the Apes, and it was a blockbuster success. It was one of the first movies to ever gross $1 million. That was remarkable in 1918. And after that, Mr. Burroughs decided his future could be still writing, but also making movies in Hollywood. And so he moved from Chicago to California and bought the ranch from the estate of Harrison Gray Otis. And that was 1919.
And so
from 19.
And when was it incorporated then? When did it change and get incorporated into Tarzana?
He called his ranch Tarzana. And I've spent my dozen years as president trying to find somebody who can explain why he added the A to Tarzan. Why didn't he just call it the Tarzan Ranch? Because the Tarzan was so clearly a successful one. Now, the only thing I've come up with is that one person said that might be a feminine Tarzan. He wanted to make it a feminine Spanish word, and it became Tarzana instead of by adding the A to it. That makes it feminine in the Spanish language. That's the only thing thing that has come up. But beyond that, we don't know. But the area was he started developing it into a real estate tract and sold homes and commercial property in the mid-20s, around 23, 24, 1925. And at that point, he called it the Tarzana Tract, and it stuck. And then later on, the U.S. Post Office put a post office branch in the area, and they called it the Tarzana Branch. And after that, the citizens of Tarzana, which were around 30,000 at the time, voted they had three names to choose from on the name of their town. They chose Tarzana. So it's been that ever since.
Wow. I mean, that's just amazing. And just you think, okay, Tarzana, what an interesting name. And then finding out its history is fascinating. It's quite a legacy also from Mr. Burroughs.
Yeah. When I moved here, a couple of years ago, it was pretty neat to see the stamp of Edgar Rice Burroughs across the town, really, because like you see, they have on the tops of the light posts, they have like monkeys and jungle type themes, like little, and there's a Tarzan fountain. There's actually a couple fountains
in front of the Whole Foods store. There's murals of Tarzan, and they're water bred, and they're on beautiful tile under the water. You can see all the artwork.
The local McDonald's has a wall of pictures of Edgar Rice Burroughs on it and stuff. It's pretty neat. Right. Yeah.
And one of the Wells Fargo branches also has quite a bit of that.
They have a nice mural on top.
You got Tarzan riding you got Tarzan riding the wagon there with Wells Fargo.
It should be, right? That's a good combination.
You got that with one on the team of 6 horses there. Okay, good.
Somebody draw that for us.
Yes. So any other particular famous quotes or things that people would be, probably have heard of or not realize that was Edgar Rice Burroughs?
Well, I read to you one quote from Ray Bradbury. He did say another one, and that is, Edgar Rice Burroughs was and is the most influential writer, bar none, of our century. So that's he was quite a fan of that, and I know there's many other authors who you could say certain things like that about also, including L. Ron Hubbard. But Mr. Burroughs, the things I have read and what he has said is that he wrote to entertain, and that's what's different about his approach to writing. He thought of these imaginative ideas and interplanetary traveling, interplanetary adventure, including interplanetary romance. But he did it to entertain his readers. And it came from when he used to tell stories to his children at bedtime. And he created a repertoire of stories, and that became one of his first books, The Princess of Mars.
He was just a natural storyteller. Like Jim said, he would make up these stories and tell them to his kids. And I think that is why he was able to transition to something like the Ediphone device and have a dictation, machine, because he was used to this oral tradition. And in that way, I think one of the reasons he resonates is because he is like the bards of old, like Homer, just telling these fantastic stories of these heroes on these crazy adventures, So I think he just had that just in his blood, just a natural knack for that story, that oral storytelling that really, when he puts it on the paper, it's like you're hearing it in somebody's voice, so the bard's voice telling you these amazing stories. So
yeah, it's just interesting because there was another quote, because I did some research to see, to check in terms of the various writings and or lectures from L. Ron Hubbard. And so I read the first one at the opening here of what he said about Edgar Rice Burroughs, but there's another one too, which I think really communicates just Edgar Rice Burroughs' impact on the youth of America at the time when it came out. And he was talking to some people about standards of performance, how people are supposed to act or not act. And he says, and this is his quote from what he said, "Now you take Tarzan's standard of performance. I was a great student of Tarzan's. I used to read Edgar Rice Burroughs quite regularly when I could. Edgar Rice Burroughs' stories of Tarzan were very encouraging to the youth of America in that day. Very, very encouraging. They were a fine, upstanding example of a man acting like an ape. And I very often used to feel constrained by these books from highly civilized conduct and that sort of thing. But I was tremendously intrigued by this, since that was the standard of performance to all young America, see? If you acted like Tarzan, boy, you were in. Man, who wouldn't be willing to swing from tree to tree? I done broke my neck more than once. The dull crash, some old frayed rope strung up one way or the other, Tarzaning from tree to tree, They never tell you that the arc circumscribed by a rope is the length of the rope. But this was still a standard of performance. So just, when he was growing up, he was born in 1911, so this would be 1920 or so, how he was totally just, wanting to be like Tarzan. And it was alive, it was life. And that's one thing that Edgar Rice Burroughs did. He was alive, and his stories were alive, and they communicated living and experiencing life. And that's something, like he said later on, in that first quote there, it's we're having a rough time today in the arts, I should say, so where it's not, people aren't as alive as he was back then.
Yeah, Tarzan is one of the most ubiquitous names. It's just everywhere. And like, if you think about like the popular, like the most, like there are maybe like 3 or 5 names throughout all of literature or popular culture, really, that are recognizable instantly. Like you instantly know that. And Tarzan is one of those. So you have Superman, you got Sherlock Holmes, and you got Tarzan. If you do the Tarzan yell, people instantly know what that is. Like that is something just they instinctively know from generation to generation, because there's always been a Tarzan for whatever generation. It's been for a century. So.
Yeah, I grew up under Johnny Weissmuller, watching all of his movies there as Tarzan.
Yeah.
And then it was interesting, I went to Universal Studios seeing the jungle that he was filming in.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite Tarzan story?
Tarzan story, in particular Tarzan. Okay.
Actually, let me make that broader. What's your favorite Edgar Rice Burroughs story?
I would answer that by first prefacing it with, he wrote about 25 to 30 different storylines. We've talked about John Carter, and we've talked about Tarzan and Carson Napier of Venus, but there's another 25 stories that he wrote, and we have commemorated those in a new web comic program. So on our website, erburroughs.com, you can go to the comics and you can see 26 different storylines of different stories that he wrote. Tarzan is just 2 of them, and then all the rest of the things he wrote. But one of the ones that people, and myself included, have said is one of his best written novels was called The War Chief. And that was a story about a baby boy who was kidnapped by the Indians in the last century, in the 18th century, and raised by the Indians thinking he was an Indian. And turned out he wasn't. But the reason it was so well written is that Edgar Rice Burroughs in 1895 was a member of the Army and assigned to Fort Grant, Arizona. And his job was to chase outlaw Apaches. And his quote was, good thing for me, I never caught any of them. So, but he spent a year there, and he got to know the whole Indian culture very, very well, the Apache culture as a result of that. And he was already an expert horseman. He had gone, he graduated from the Michigan Military Academy, and he was an expert horseman already. And then he went to his older brother's ranch in Idaho and broke broncos, so he knew how to ride a wild horse too. And he combined the knowledge of horses and the knowledge of the Indian culture in a very favorable viewpoint of the Indians, Apache Indians at the turn of the century, of 1899 to 1910, with this time frame that was taking place. And that, the movie Dances with Wolves is very favorable to the Indian viewpoint. Well, he preceded that by 50 years with his book called The War Chief. And there was another follow-up to that called The Apache Devil. And there's romance involved, and always Mr. Burroughs includes a romantic element, always in good taste, but he always includes a romantic element in all of his storylines. And that's true here too. So that would be my selection as one of the.
That's interesting. I'll get back to you, Christopher, in just a moment, but it's just interesting that you said that, because that was absolutely unique what you said there, with, that the Native American was portrayed as the, in a good light, whether or not they're the protagonist, but they were definitely, were they like the good guy in the story?
Yes.
Yeah. Because when L. Ron Hubbard wrote his first novel, which was 2 decades later, the Buckskin Brigades, in the late 20s, the publisher had him edit it because his was so strong in favor of the Indian, the Pecuni, the Blackfeet, and the fur traders were the bad guys. They were the ones that were the criminals that came over from England, that he had to edit it to make it not so strong, in favor of the Native Americans, of the Indians. And when we republished it in the 80s, we were able to take it back to his original manuscript. But it was a definite, what Mr. Burroughs did that was definitely going against the grain to write that and publish it like that.
Yeah, it was a very sympathetic view of, it was during the period of Geronimo, and a very sympathetic view of that. And he also, that carries over into his Mars series, his Barsoom series with John Carter of Mars, because that begins in the Southwest, and he has a little run-in with some Apaches and goes and hides out in the cave, and that's where he mysteriously transports to Barsoom from this cave under strange circumstances. And but his depiction of the Red Martians in particular, I think were in Barsoom in general, I think was a lot inspired by his time in the Southwest, and he did make they're called the Red Martians is what they're called in the series. He made them really the dominant group on Mars, who is really holding the planet together. There's an atmosphere plant that they've built to keep civilization around on this dying world, but he really sort of, I think he had this very sympathetic view of the Native American just from his time in there. There's some interesting quotes. I don't have them handy here, but where he talks about his experiences there, and very, very favorable. Jim and I went to a convention in the Southwest and we visited Fort Grant, where Edgar Rice Burroughs was stationed in the Southwest. It was pretty interesting.
That's true.
Yeah.
We have 2 fan events every year of different places around the country, and one of them is called the Dum Dum, which is named after the meeting call of the apes in the jungle, Dum Dum, Dum Dum. And the other one is Edgar Rice Burroughs' Chain of Friendship, ECOF we call it. But they did all want to go once at least to Fort Grant, Arizona area. The fort is no longer there, but it's actually been replaced by a state penitentiary.
Yeah.
So we caravan. There's about 30 cars caravanning from this little town where we could all stay into the wilderness where the fort was, and we could see the mountains that he would describe in his books. The war chief, when he was chasing the Apaches, he described the mountain range that he'd have to traverse, and we saw it in person. And they wouldn't let us get very close to the penitentiary. We had to stay about a mile away. But 30 carloads of fans certainly enjoyed the trip.
Wow. So now, Christopher, what's your favorite Burroughs novel?
Oh my gosh, it's really hard for me to say. I do love the Mars series, Princess of Mars. John Carter series is really one of my favorites. I actually like a couple of the books that really struck me that are like that not many people know about as much. They're not his most famous works. He wrote one called I Am a Barbarian, which was actually published posthumously in I think 1967, 67, I think 67, and it's a story about ancient Rome. So, and he was very well studied in the classics when he went to grammar school, and in his early education he studied Greek and Latin, and so he worked that into his novels. Sometimes there's a novel called that we just published or about to publish called Tarzan in the Lost Empire, where Tarzan finds a lost Roman colony in Africa, and he employed all of his knowledge of ancient Rome for that book. I really enjoyed that book a lot, and just got to reread it because I got to edit it. But I'm a Barbarian is a great story about a young boy who's brought from Britain basically and captured and brought to Rome. Ends up growing up like kind of studying under one of the gladiators and becomes a gladiator himself. It's just a really rollicking story. It's a little bit different from his other stuff, and he was inspired, I think, at that point by Robert Graves, who had written I, Claudius, and he wanted to kind of come out with his own version of that, but he wasn't able to sell it at the time, so he put it in the trunk and came out later. But I really enjoy that one. And then The Mucker, also, I would say The Mucker is a story of transformation. It has a sort of an anti-hero character called Billy Byrne, who grew up in the back streets of Chicago, really just raised in a life of crime, and he kind of struggles he gets kind of thrown into this adventure where he ends up on a lost island with a remnant of Japanese samurais on the island, but he falls in love, and the love transforms the love of this character, this woman that he falls in love with, transforms him, and he has to struggle against his nature. It's very similar to Tarzan in a way that Tarzan had to struggle between his civilized nature and the jungle upbringing that he had, and he had to come to terms with that, which he eventually does. And very similarly, Billy Byrne has to struggle with, his worst instincts from his bad upbringing, and overcome them. And Edgar Rice Burroughs was an eternal optimist, I would say, in his writings. He really looked for hope, I think, and he wanted good to triumph over evil. He wanted the hero to win, but he puts them through some really difficult stuff before they actually get to that point, and it's always an entertaining story. But I love The Mucker because it's the story of transformation. It's a great story.
Almost every other book he wrote, the protagonist is already a good guy and sort of a hero. But Christopher's correct. This is the only anti-hero he ever created. This was the bad guy who did bad things until he fell in love, and then he just transformed. However, I won't give away the storyline, but those two never do connect, but it certainly had major influence on his life.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. So any particular Edgar Rice Burroughs story, just like anecdote or something about his life that particularly sticks to either one of you or both of you?
Well, we have a famous photograph here of him and his son witnessing the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And he and his son were playing tennis that morning on a different part of the island. And they saw the planes coming over, and they saw the bombs, etc. They thought it was, everyone in the neighborhood thought it was an exercise, a war exercise, a training exercise. They didn't realize it was a real thing for about 30 minutes. And then it dawned on everybody, we're being attacked. But because of that, he gave up quite a bit of his writing. You won't find many things written in the early 40s because he became a war correspondent. He was the oldest war correspondent in the Pacific Theater during his career. So he was always a patriotic man. He loved America. He thought this is the best country, and that things were going right here, and And if they weren't right, he wrote a letter to his grandson when he was born and said, make sure you talk to those congressmen. If they're not doing things right, you make sure you tell them what to do. So he wanted to encourage his grandchildren to be active thinkers and active viewers of the American scene, because he had his own commentary on it during his career. He's hoping his offspring would do the same.
Wow, what a great story. Anything for yourself, Christopher?
Let's see here.
Oh, that maybe is a hard one to be able to because that's pretty intense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think just the story. I mean, we talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but just the story of his life, the fact that he, it's just this podcast is sort of aimed at aspiring writers. The fact that he tried everything, like every kind of business. He was working in a pencil sharpener factory, trying to sell pencil sharpeners when he wrote A Princess of Mars. In fact, he wrote on the back of the stationery from that pencil sharpener company. And so I think that, how old was he when he first had A Princess of Mars published? I want to say he was like 36, 34. Yeah, and well into his 30s by the time he came to being a writer. So I think that, just the story that he overcame so many obstacles, and then, before he finally fell into the writing thing and realized this is what I do well, and this is what I can make a business out of writing. It took him a while to get there. And I think just that perseverance of his character, and like, as a writer myself, it's just, you have to keep trying different things, and he tried different aspects of his life, different occupations. He finally landed on the writing thing and just made it work. And when he got to the writing thing, he didn't just stop there and just write stories and then kind of fade out of the picture. He tackled it head on, and made a big business out of it for himself. And he was notorious for arguing for his rights as an author, and for getting the best word rate, cent per word. And he just really, and he shopped his stories to all sorts of different publishers trying to find the best deal. So he's really a good symbol, I think, for authors, somebody that they can look to, for somebody who just persevered and made it, just through determination. There's talent there, but also that determination is just equally important, I think,
Absolutely. Did he ever write any essays or have any comments for other writers or aspiring writers? Did he ever do anything like a book on writing or like that he did?
Not so much. I mean, there are some articles that he wrote kind of like from his point of view as a writer, and like Jim said, it was mainly his main theme there was write to entertain, write to entertain, and it's interesting because he did put kind of Swiftian satire in his writings too. So there are symbols definitely in his writing where he kind of buries a point that he's trying to get across, but he doesn't hit you over the head with it so much. He sticks it in there, and if you notice it, you notice it. If you don't, you don't. But he did wordplay and stuff with some characters who were popular in his day, politicians or what have you, and made some little Swiftian satires at them. So he did write to entertain, but he had a wit to him, definitely.
Was satire a big part of what he did?
I would say it was an important element to what he did. He like I said, he would slip it in there. He poked fun at humanity a lot. Pretty interesting, just across the board at humanity. He didn't believe in. This is a theme that runs throughout his work, but he didn't really like time. He didn't believe in time. In fact, I jotted down a quote here. This kind of gives you a sort of sense of. He said, "Man has invented time to suit the limitations of his finite mind, just as he has named another thing that he can neither explain nor understand, space." That's from The Moon Maid. But that same theme, and you can see him sort of poking at humanity there, just by saying, the limitations of his finite mind. There's a famous quote from Tarzan where Tarzan says, "Men are strange beasts." like he can't really understand the civilized man, So he has a lot of that in there. So he wasn't that's like the character of his writing. He was writing these adventure stories, but he had a lot of character that he added to it just from his own viewpoint. I think that really makes these books special. His stories, eternal, basically. So.
Yeah, one thing I think that stands out and something for people that are listening to this, writers, is that with Mr. Burroughs, story was boss. For him, it was about this story. Everything else kind of like was secondary to that. Like you said, he was a storyteller. And I've heard, that, some people get into the literary fiction, where it's important, this word, and they're really caught up in the words. But Mr. Burroughs was caught up in just telling a good, fun story that, pretty much, I guess all fiction is escapist literature to a greater or lesser degree, but this is very much to a greater degree that you can then, like that one L. Ron Hubbard quote, he envisioned himself being Tarzan, unfortunately he didn't understand that, that a rope would swing and that when you go down, the arc of the rope is the length of the rope. And so he would go down and smash into the ground thinking that, that wouldn't happen. But how many kids, were Tarzan? I just was fascinated. I loved climbing trees. I didn't do the swinging part, but I was definitely going from branch to branch, pretending I was Tarzan, so I think it's amazing. Story is so important.
Absolutely. And he I was just reading Tarzan and the Lost Empire, and I was just admiring how tightly plotted it was. Oh my gosh. He just, and